Hello, friends, and welcome to the Dubcast with Dubside. I'm Andrew Lazaga, and on the phone with me is Dubside. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Yeah, I'm glad we got this Dubcast off the ground. When you first asked me about doing this, when you first brought up the idea, that was last fall. That was like October, September sometime.
Has it been that long?
Yeah, well, we had to kick the idea around a little bit and play with it before we got it to where it's at now. But I think we got it, something going on here. Have we got any feedback yet?
Oh, yeah. People have been reacting very positively to it.
All right.
The other day, I was talking to a friend, and I had actually sent him our preview of the first podcast just to see what he thought about it. And he said, this is great. Dubside does an amazing job. But, Andrew, who's really going to listen to all this? And I said, well, what do you mean? It's for people who like Greenland-style sea kayaking. What I think he doesn't understand is that the people who are into Greenland-style kayaking are some of the most passionate people I know. And some of the most imaginative, resourceful, and intelligent people I've ever met, I met through Greenland-style kayaking events.
The people drawn to Greenland kayaking tend to be a very interesting bunch. Some of them are the outlier type people. You and I have been through the evolution of this Greenland stuff. There were times where it was far more controversial than it is now in the kayaking community.
Oh yeah, people should know that back in the day, Greenland style was not as widely accepted as it is today.
Yeah, in fact, some of the more established sea kayakers will look down on Greenland paddles.
They call them lolly sticks in the UK,
Yeah, or museum sticks. I've heard that one.
I haven't heard that one.
It's taken quite some time to get the respect I think that Greenland stuff deserves.
Yes, things eventually turned around, and the coaches had to come around, and I think it was just because so many people were interested in it. They had to.
Yeah, and it has the research and development of centuries of input from experimentation to get to where it got us. So it wasn't like somebody just invented something in their basement and brought it around to try to get people to look at it. But they say that truth goes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed, then it is violently opposed, and then it's finally accepted as self-evident. And I think that's where the Greenland paddle is.
That's absolutely right. And on that note, let's go on to the Dubcast number 2.
All right.
Welcome to the Dubcast with Dubside. This is Dubcast number 2. And in the next half hour, I will tell you about buying a kayak for the first time, how I bought my first kayak, the first time I paddled my kayak, and some of the gear that I found to be necessary and some of the gear that I found to be not necessary for kayaking. I'll tell you about a guy named Randy Hendrickson and another guy named George Gronseth. I'll give you my thoughts on the mindset and attitude that I use when I go paddling. And we will revisit the QAJAQ song from Dubcast number 1. That's what I got coming up. So here it is. Buying a kayak is something like getting an outfit of clothing. Of course, it's got to fit you properly. But there's no one set of clothing that's perfect for working out at a gym and going to a wedding and painting a house and going swimming. Same way, there's no one kayak that's perfect for racing and going camping and maneuvering and rolling and very inexpensive. These are all different considerations, and you have to sort of pick and select what works best for you, compromising between those different factors. When I was first in the market for a kayak, I had an additional constraint that brought the number of available options way, way down to a manageable level. I was intending to use this kayak without a car because I did not own a car. In fact, I've never owned a car, and to this day I've never owned a car. That's another story. Without a car, my choices were between a folding kayak or an inflatable kayak. Now, folding kayaks, there's a frame made out of either wood or aluminum that sort of assembles and slides into a skin. And when you take it apart, it goes into a large backpack kind of a thing. Inflatable kayaks obviously blow up or uninflate and go into some sort of a bag. Well, this was in 1998, and back then the main inflatable kayak on the market that I had found in my research was about $200, and it was made of a material similar to a beach ball, this PVC stuff. Life expectancy was about the life expectancy of a beach ball, maybe 2 years or so before it falls apart. For the folding kayak option, I found a company called Feathercraft, and they made their entry-level model was called the K-Lite, and it could be expected to last at least for 10 years. It cost $2,000. Living in Philadelphia, I found out about a place up in New York City called the New York Kayak Company, and the guy there was Randy Hendrickson. He had the K-Lites in stock, and he could ship one down to me in the mail if I was ready to spend $2,000. And that was more money than I'd ever spent on any one thing in my life up to that point. And so, torn between the cheap $200 option or the $2,000 option with the longevity of at least 10 years, I decided to go with the long-term option, and I sent Randy $2,000. Now, not only had I never seen a folding kayak in real life, I had never been in a kayak of any sort before. The only paddling I'd ever done was in a canoe. I definitely had my fingers crossed. And Randy had told me, since he wasn't a huge dealer with a massive liberal return policy, he was just a small-time guy selling some kayaks, and he could send this to me. I could look at it, I could put the thing together, I could take it apart, I could check it out that way. But if I were to put it in water, I couldn't return it, because then it was used and he couldn't take it back. It came in the mail, a big cardboard box. I opened it up. It took me over an hour to put the whole thing together, following the instructions carefully. I eventually, since I had lots of practice, had that down to under 15 minutes. The K-Lite weighs under 40 pounds. The frame is aluminum tubing that some of it is bungeed together, and the outside fabric, it's a Hypalon material. Some of the cross ribs are some polycarbonate kind of composition. The K-Lite comes with a spray skirt, and Randy sold me a 2-piece paddle to go with it and a PFD. That's personal flotation device, life jacket. According to the first entry in my logbook, on the 27th of September, 1998, I took a bus out to a quiet lake and put this K-Lite together, put it on the water, and got in, paddled about 15 feet from the shore, and I'd been told that folding kayaks are more stable than regular kayaks. And so I leaned out over the side with my standard of stability was from canoeing. So I leaned out way over to the water, and then I realized I leaned a little bit too far. And I'm perched over the water. You know how time stops in those intense moments? So I'm realizing that I'm going to fall in, And I'm thinking, what am I supposed to do here? How do I brace? What's the technique here? And nothing was coming instinctively, and I face planted right into the water and turned the kayak over. So much for planning on not getting wet. The first maneuver taught in any kayak class is the wet exit, how to get out of the kayak if it tips over. Well, I figured this out very quickly on the fly. The K-Lite doesn't have a really tight cockpit, and the nylon spray skirt I had wasn't real tight, so it popped off fairly easily, fortunately. I think it was shallow enough for me to stand up on the bottom and turn the kayak over and pull it back to the shore and empty the water out and get back in. My main consideration, though, was to look around and see if anybody had been watching. And I was happy to see that nobody did, because I'm sure they would have been laughing hysterically. 4 days later, I took the kayak out for the second time, and I had some dry clothes just in case. And I had reviewed the procedure for the wet exit and how you reach up and pull the spray skirt open and slide your legs out like you're taking off a pair of pants so you don't get stuck. I figured if I did tip over, I could at least try to come out gracefully enough that I could claim I was practicing and not look like a rank amateur, even though that's what I was. In the months to come, I was very happy with the kayak. No regrets about spending $2,000, but a little dismayed to realize that I was nowhere near finished spending money. I was talking to Randy on a regular basis, buying dry bags, wetsuit, paddling jacket, compass, spare paddle. The list just seems to go on and on. I did encounter a couple things that I decided in the end I did not need, and I'll pass them on to you. Drip rings are these little rings that go around the paddle and are supposed to deflect the water from running down the shaft and getting on your hands or dripping in your lap. You don't need them. If you want to stay bone dry at all times, kayaking is not for you. Another item I find to be unnecessary is a knife on your PFD. Now, the whitewater folks, they have a legitimate need to cut their way out of a situation where you have moving water and you're throwing rescue lines and that sort of thing. But in sea kayaking, two things tend to happen to knives on PFDs. One is the salt water will corrode them, despite what the manufacturers claim. The other thing that happens is one day you look at your PFD and you've got an empty sheath, no knife. And you never figure out whether it fell out, or you took it out and left it somewhere, or somebody else took it out, or what happened to it. Here's a better option. This comes from a guy named Steve Maynard, one of the top British coaches in a younger generation from Derek Hutchinson's era. Steve says, get yourself some Emt Shears. Cost you something like $5. Put them in the pocket of your PFD. And those two opposing blades with the serrated edges do a much better job of cutting most anything you need to cut than a single blade that you're swinging around that's going to cut what you don't want it to cut. And if they get too corroded, you just buy yourself another pair. Another thing I used for a while because it seemed like a good idea, but eventually stopped using, was a paddle leash. That's a line that attaches around the middle of the paddle with a Velcro closure, and then you can tie the other end either onto you on your PFD or onto the kayak somewhere. And the idea being, if you drop the paddle, you just pull the line back in and you haven't lost the paddle. Trouble occurs when you capsize and are trying to do a wet exit, and that line finds its way around your neck in the worst case scenario. And then a knife to cut your way out of that situation might help, except that if you're trying to cut something around your neck underwater, there's all sorts of bad scenarios can happen there. So a paddle leash, I don't think is a good idea. A spare paddle on the deck is a better option there. unnecessary items so far: drip rings, knives, paddle leashes. I will add to that list rudders. That's that big fin-looking thing at the back end of the kayak that swings down into the water and is controlled by foot pedals. Now, it seems like that would be a very effective way to steer a kayak, but actually proper technique does a much better job. And there is a different item called a skeg, which is a fin that slides into a slot underneath the kayak. That's worth having. The rudder you don't need. All right, well, if you're doing a 10 to 20 mile crossing open water with a side wind, maybe you can make an argument for a rudder. Otherwise, I don't think you need one. One more gadget that will break, usually at the worst possible time. A big proponent of what he calls rudder-free kayak design is my friend George Gronseth. And let me tell you about George. George knows kayaking. And when I say knows kayaking, I'm talking about like on the Derek Hutchinson level. Him and his wife Barb have an operation called QAJAQ Academy out in the Seattle area. They've been doing kayak instruction as well as sales and rentals for, has it been 30 some years now? Quite some time. George was once an engineer for Boeing, the airplane manufacturer, and he brings that analytical problem-solving thinking to anything he encounters. And he's always collecting data, keeping track, testing things, and he's got such a wealth of information, it's quite remarkable. I'll give you an example of George in problem-solving mode. So, if you drill holes in something as hard as steel, and you want to drill them accurately, you have to make a little mark, a little indentation for the drill bit to center on so it won't slide. And I was out at QAJAQ Academy one time and had to do some project involving drilling holes in steel. And that was a problem, how to get them lined up properly with a little indentation that's not going to slip. So you need something to make that little indentation. So I asked George, I said, George, what have you got? And I've got drilling these holes in this thing. And he goes, oh. And he brings me this, it looked like this some gray sort of cylindrical thing, like about kind of like the end of a cigar shape sort of thing, with some kind of a tip on it, not a sharp point, but a tip. So I took that thing and lined it up on the mark and pounded that with a hammer to make the indentation. It made a mark. But of course, usually things just get duller as you use them. So I kept on using this thing, and every single time it made a mark in exactly the right spot. Didn't dull the thing at all. It was perfect, ideal thing for the job. So I said, George, what is this thing? And he said, I got that when I worked for Boeing. It is an armor-piercing bullet. The end of that is depleted uranium. It's slightly radioactive. I hadn't expected him to have something like that in his toolkit, but he had found a very effective solution to that problem. And George brings that same analytical thinking to his instruction. And the first time people get in a kayak, it can be difficult to get the kayak to stay in a straight line. You just start wobbling all over the place. And that's what makes a rudder seem so attractive, because it seems to make so much sense. You got that big fin in the back and you steer with your feet and you keep the kayak in a straight line. But you don't need a rudder. And George, in his instruction, he's got it broken down to there are 7 different ways that you can keep the kayak in a straight line, steering the kayak, that don't involve a rudder. And this is if you want the kayak to go to the left, you can paddle harder on the right side. You can take more strokes on the right side. You can sweep the paddle further out away from the kayak on the right side. You can sweep in reverse on the other side. That will slow you down somewhat. You can lengthen the paddle, extend the paddle so that it's longer on the right side. That'll steer you to the left. And you can, using your hips, edge the kayak, lift the left side of the kayak up as you paddle, and that will tend to move the kayak towards the left. And that is, what if I got 6 there? 6, I forget what the 7th one is. Well, 6 out of 7 is not bad. When you get a lot of wind involved, steering the kayak can be an even bigger task. And if you're trying to go downwind, if you're trying to go in the same direction as the wind will naturally make a kayak turn into the wind, so you're going upwind. Just the way it's a physics thing where the kayak swings around. And George has a good tip I learned from him. If you want to go downwind, in a very strong wind, it's difficult to control where the kayak's going other than into the wind. All you have to do is back up, paddle backwards, and the wind will naturally swing the kayak around, so you're going downwind. Very simple technique. And whenever I'm in the Seattle area, which is usually once a year, I always stop in and see George and Barb. And he runs his business out of his residence, so I'll stay there for a week, help out around the shop. He's got a handful of employees, and there's always lots of activity going on there. He has a website. The Kayak Academy website is chock full of that kind of information. I'll give you one more George story. You know how in this day and age with YouTube, the most extreme version of anything can be found online, and it's very intimidating to see. For example, whitewater kayaking, people are going over 100-foot waterfalls and coming very close to killing themselves, or people are paddling, let's say, Frey Hoffmeister is going around continents, paddling around Australia, and you feel so inadequate to comparing us normal human beings compared to these superhumans that just intimidate us. And so I was, as a reaction to this, I made up the most extreme version of kayaking I could think of, like top this. So I want to see somebody, this would require a titanium kayak and a titanium paddle and probably some asbestos clothing. I want to see somebody paddle volcanic lava flows. Okay? Can anybody top that? So I'm over at Kayak Academy one night, and I'm sitting around the dinner table, and we're talking, as we do. George likes to grill salmon in the backyard and have very nice meals in that way. So I mentioned this story. I say, could somebody paddle lava flows? You'd have to have a titanium kayak. And George says, well, I was once in Hawaii, and he proceeds to tell us that he was there, one particular time he was there, and there was an active volcano somewhere, you couldn't go there, it was all restricted. And him and some other people snuck into the restricted area and paddled up along the shoreline to where the actual lava flow was coming down into the water. And he said it was steaming off and everything. And I'm thinking, oh, come on. I make up this impossible story and leave it to me to be talking to the one person who's actually come very close to almost doing it. That is George. The way I see it, what George doesn't know about kayaking, you don't need to know. Well, I took readily to exploring the lakes, streams, and rivers of the Philadelphia area. And by February of the year 2000, my kayaking logbook was up to trip number 100. And I thought it would be a nice gesture to indicate to Randy at the New York Kayak Company how much I appreciated the fact that I'd gotten this wonderful kayak from him. So I went to one of those trophy places. They make the trophies and awards and things, and had them make a brass plaque. And it had engraved on the brass plaque, it said something like, thank you, Randy of New York Kayak Company, for the Feathercraft K-Light on the occasion of the 100th voyage. I think I said, thank you for 18 months of paddling bliss. And I sent that to Randy. Well, I've had many, many more years of paddling bliss. And I've had several other kayaks, several other Feathercraft kayaks that I've used extensively doing my buses and trains thing. And then I've been able to borrow kayaks a lot in my travels after that, since I'm going all around the world. When I first started traveling, I was bringing a folding kayak with me, but as the airline started to charge for every extra little thing, it became somewhat cost prohibitive to take a whole kayak along with the other gear I had to bring. So I just took to finding kayaks to borrow in the places I went to. But recently, I got back to that Feathercraft K-Lite. I'd lent it out to people over the years, and it had been other places, but just recently, I had it with me again, and I took the thing out, put it together, went paddling with it. And that kayak is still a fully functional working kayak. It's seen some wear and tear, but it still works just fine 22 years after I made that initial investment. So I think it was the right move to make, and I've certainly got my money's worth out of that kayak. Thinking back to those early days, early years, when Randy was my main kayak connection, way before I had met George, I discovered early on that kayaking was a very, very pleasant way to get away from the day-to-day frustrations, the computer screen, the desk, and that whole environment. And within a relatively short amount of time, you're out on the water in a whole different set of surroundings, and it's a wonderful way to escape. And I developed this a little exercise that I would do. I had the kayak all put together and everything ready to go, and I would, along the shoreline, find some little object. Could be a stick, twig, rock, something. Find something that I would use to symbolize all my frustrations and worries of that particular day or that particular week, or just things that were sort of weighing me down on my mind. And I would look at that little object and say, okay, this is all my frustrations and worries. And I'm going to put this down here on the ground, on the shore. And I'm going to leave it on the shore. I'm going to get into my kayak and paddle away, and that stuff is not coming with me out on the water. And when I get back, it'll be here. And if I even forget to even look at it when I get back, it'll find me, because that is my life off the water. But when I'm on the water, that is not going to be on my mind. And that way I could really relax and enjoy the moment of being out on the water kayaking. And over time, I came to think of the water. And when you first start paddling, you're very concerned, very worried about tipping over. And the water is this big adversary that's after you, and you have to protect yourself at all costs. But particularly after learning how to roll a kayak, one becomes more in tune with the water. And I look at it as thinking that the water is your friend. And I came up with this little mantra that says, this is in my first rolling DVD. It says, the water is your friend. If you love your friend, respect your friend, understand your friend, and protect your friend the water will never harm you. And that little meditation I use all the time. Every time before I get in a kayak, I just run through that in my head to remind myself that the water is your friend. Following the pattern of Dubcast number 1, the last few minutes of my portion of the Dubcast will contain some music from Greenland. And I have another version of the QAJAQ song with the Greenlandic words. And this will be the entire song with all 5 verses, starting out with that line, Uanga Naminek. And I've made this version, the music in this version is trying to capture and supplement the idea that the water is your friend. So I would like you to listen now to a new version of the QAJAQ song. All right. I'll cover the full English translation of all those Greenlandic verses at some point in the future. For now, just remember, the water is your friend. If you love your friend, respect your friend, understand your friend, and protect your friend the water will never harm you. And that wraps it up for my portion of Dubcast number 2. I'll turn it over to Andrew and catch up with you on number 3.
Be sure to check out the show notes for some links, including to Dubside's 2 videos, Greenland Rolling with Dubside and Modern Greenland Kayaking, available on my YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to share, comment, like, and subscribe. You can also follow us on YouTube. If you have any questions for Dubside, or if you just want to let us know what you think of this podcast, feel free to drop us an email at dubcastwithdubside@gmail.com, and we will answer your questions in the upcoming episodes. Also, please consider donating through Patreon at Dubcast with Dubside. You can also donate directly using PayPal to our email address, dubcastwithdubside@gmail.com. All proceeds go to support Dubside's next sea kayaking adventure, so he can return with more knowledge, insights, and amazing stories.